a deep dive into the Army's history of misspelling Latino last names. All of that and more today, June 26th, 2023. Good morning, early birds. I'm Zimone Perez, and this is the Early Bird Brief, produced by Defense News and Military Times. Today, I sit down with senior Army Times reporter Davis Winkie about a story we co-reported on about old Army administrative databases and how they contributed to spelling errors on the Korean War Memorial Wall of Remembrance and in press releases. Davis, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Zimone, and thanks for inviting yourself for once, too.
Yeah, no kidding. Moderator and reporter all in one. Absolutely. So really, we got this idea, right, from just spitballing on a Slack channel. We had done previous reporting. You had really spearheaded the initial reporting about the errors on the Korean War Memorial Wall of Remembrance, where I had done one or two follow-up stories after you. Then we noticed in a press release from Fort Cavazos that they had announced a death of a private, Ana Basaldua Ruiz, and they completely botched her name. And in some ways, it's like, in the one moment you want your name spelled correctly, there are probably two. One, when you're born on your birth certificate, and two, when you pass away as your memory to the rest of the world. And so we wanted to dive into this and see, is this just a lack of care on the service's part, or is this a system issue? And so you kind of, in your previous experience just as a reservist with the Army, kind of dug into that. So what did you find with regards to these system errors?
So when I was still in the Army National Guard, working in human resources, I would notice in the systems that people with surnames that required hyphens or spaces, whether that was something that was cultural, such as the case with Latino, apellidos, or in the case of people who just wanted to hyphenate their name after marriage, for example. I noticed that not all of the systems could correctly render those names, but I never really paid much attention to it because I wasn't personally impacted. I have a pretty straightforward last name, even if it's kind of funny to say sometimes. And that was just something that was in the back of my head. And then when I reported on the Korean War Wall of Remembrance, I realized, this really can have consequences if the formatting of a name can't be correctly recorded. And that's the memory of you left to the world. And when the death at Fort Cavazos of Ana Basaldua Ruiz occurred, that's when you and I together really realized, there is an ongoing pattern here. And we just started digging through technical documentation and regulations to try to see, what systems could be the linchpin of this continued failure to correctly honor Latino last names.
Yeah, and so could you kind of take us through these historical databases that might not most aptly compute, last names that, kind of deviate from the Anglo norm in which they were prepared for?
For the Army, automated record keeping for personnel purposes emerged out of necessity when war kind of grew to an industrial scale in the early 20th century. There were some experiments during World War I with finding ways to automate personnel functions. And then in World War II, the Army in Europe developed a new casualty tracking system using punch card machines by IBM that were able to sort things based on little holes that were punched in these cards that a machine could read. And that really allowed for a different level of accuracy and speed in personnel tracking, especially when it came to casualties. You could get that information transmitted back home quickly, which meant that you could update family members in near real time about what had happened to their loved ones. That stood in pretty stark contrast to what had happened in previous wars, where, you wouldn't know until you received a letter in the mail from somebody's commander or something like that about whether your loved one was okay or not. During the Korean War, this punch card system was down to something of a science. There were, thick guides for how to enter names on casualty punch cards and other similar systems. And because of the limited real estate on a punch card, because they only come in one size and they're a really rudimentary form of computing, there were strict instructions. Remove spaces from last names, remove hyphens from last names, remove any kind of special character, and smush names together. That was how the original listing of casualties in the Korean War was compiled. We'll set that aside for a minute because that proves to be a problem later on. But even as the Army adopted successor personnel systems over the years, a lot of them were built on your earliest coding languages. And I want to talk about one called COBOL. COBOL stands for Common Business-Oriented Language. It was developed as part of a joint consortium between the military and really big corporations in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It was one of the first ever big time programming languages that could handle a lot of stuff. And it mimicked punch cards because it was designed to be able to run both digitally and with punch card backups that you could feed into these machines. And so the same constraints that were inherent to punch cards were also baked into COBOL programmed systems. In the Army's main personnel database until 2022, the Total Army Personnel Database, or TAPDB for short, was running on COBOL, which meant the name field in the Army's personnel database of record could not handle hyphens, spaces, apostrophes, or any other special character all the way until last year. Now, there's a new database the Army has, the Integrated Pay and Personnel System, that can handle such characters. But the caveat there is that any database is as good as its inputs. And because the names of current troops in the old TAPDB were imported into the new system as its starting point, all of its original errors are still there and need to be corrected one by one. So that's kind of how we've gotten to the present day, where even though the Army now has a system that can handle these names, it's still putting out press releases sometimes where somebody's official name is just not the way that they themselves or their families would write it out.
Yeah, and it's not just a issue of, people are like, okay, names get misspelled all the time or are incorrectly formatted, but names are important, right? A guiding principle of the story is that names do have power, and names don't just tell the stories of just yourself in this moment, but they tell the story of your family, of your heritage, of, your people, right? Those who've come before you. And so it's a big deal to not have your name spelled correctly. And that's just one of the simplest things you can do as a sign of respect to someone, especially like with Basaldua Ruiz's case in her death, her untimely death. And so we kind of dug into why two last names in theory. And from researching, it showed that, these, I think you mentioned it earlier, these apellidos, which is technically what translates to last name, could better be translated from Spanish to family name. And so it is an effort to honor both the mother and the father's families. It's not just offering a last name, but really showing the legacies that the children hold for both of their families, really. That was really interesting to see. But then when we brought these instances to lawmakers and to advocates, they were pretty annoyed to see these errors still occurring in the year of our Lord 2023, right? So how were some of these lawmakers frustrated that you found?
The lawmakers' frustration is hung on a couple of things. One was when we brought them our findings about why the Army has continued to fail to correctly honor Latino surnames for decades. But another part of it stems from problems with names on the Korean War Veterans Memorial's Wall of Remembrance, which was unveiled on the National Wall last summer in Washington, D.C. And one of the problems with the Wall of Remembrance is that a lot of the names of Latino soldiers on there are all service members, not just Army, and other groups whose names frequently have spaces or hyphens or other such characters like Native Americans. Many of them were incorrectly cut into stone on the wall because the source database that was provided to the foundation who did the work was not up to the task. It was as good as the info that had been put into it more than 70 years ago at this point. And that has proved controversial. Both you and I, Simone, have written some about the errors on the wall, and so has the New York Times. And over the course of this year, lawmakers have been pretty spun up about this. The South Korean government has vowed to see the names on the wall that are wrong get corrected. Multiple House and Senate committees reached out to the Defense Department demanding an explanation. And just recently, the DoD has briefed members of Congress on the issue, but ones that we spoke to for this story indicated that they need this to get fixed one way or another. And at this point, it's just a matter of figuring out the best way.
Yeah, definitely. And so there remains to be seen on how we go about fixing it. It seems like there's a solution in place, but it's just a matter of getting everybody on that same playing field to fix.
And part of the challenge with regard to the wall specifically is that we don't have an exact number of errors, because documenting that a name is an error requires a lot of research. It requires, looking into historical records, finding gravestones, things like that are the only way to substantiate that a name is incorrectly rendered. And while some advocates are arguing that there could be more than 1,000 misspelled or misformatted names on the walls, it's going to be really difficult to even find a starting point to fully grasp the scope of the error. And then, do you have to recut all of the panels of the monument? I don't even know. There's a lot of questions that haven't yet been answered. And the Korean War Veterans Memorial Foundation didn't respond to any of our questions that we sent them for this story. But then with the Army, though, the Army sees a path to resolution moving forward, because individual soldiers, now that the database can handle their names, just need to submit a customer relations management system ticket asking to get their name changed. Basically, it's the same process that anybody would follow, say if they get married and want to change their name after that. It's just, hey, bring in some documentation showing that this is the way your name should be formatted, whether that's your birth certificate, the driver's license. I don't know for certain what the acceptable documents would be on this kind of thing, but essentially Army Human Resources Command officials we spoke with for this story said, help us help you get your name fixed. Stop by your local human resources office and let's get these names fixed.
Definitely. Well, it seems like the Army's found a solution, but then the Korean War Memorial Wall of Remembrance, well, that just seems a little bit above our pay grade. So
yeah, we'll see what lawmakers come up with there.
Definitely. Davis Winkie, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, man.
That's it for us this morning. To get more top stories and breaking news, go to defensenews.com/EBB to subscribe to the Early Bird Brief newsletter. Please give us a like, rating, and a comment wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on social media @defense_news and @Military Times. The Early Bird Brief is hosted and produced by me, Simone Z. Perez. Today's episode featured a story by Davis Winkie and myself. Our editor-in-chief is Mike Bruce. Have a great day.